wanted to start by talking about something that initially sounds quite boring, but is incredibly important, and that is the rise of the limited company, the introduction of the limited liability company, and how it changed our world. Now, I put in my title that Adam Smith was very suspicious of the limited liability company, and he was. So let's go back and think about what life was like before you had a limited liability company, before you could invest in something and know that your losses were limited to what you had put in. Previous to that, your losses were unlimited. If you invested in a company of any kind, you're responsible for your share of its debts. So you could be wiped out by one investment. And that made investing a very niche activity. Investing in a company of any kind, becoming a partner, very niche activity, only for the very well off. The introduction of the limited liability company changed this completely. It changed our world. It was possibly the greatest, I think, conceptual innovation of all time. I'm sure lots of you would argue with that, but to my mind, this is it. We created this structure that has become the building block of every part of our environment. Everything you see around you is in some way connected to a limited liability company. Now, what it also did, how it created this, was allowing a system where shareholders could become very large groups of people living in different areas, from different backgrounds, unconnected to each other, all owning small parts of a company and all having small bits of power of that company via their vote. So why I'm explaining this, the crucial point is that because companies are the building blocks of our economies and of our societies, who controls those companies is absolutely vital to our economic freedoms, to our liberties, and to the way that our economies develop. That's the basics. Now, Adam Smith was worried about this because he felt that if you had a system like this where you could have many, many, many diverse shareholders, they would become separated from the managers of the companies, and the managers would suddenly take control. So he worried about managers using other people's money, the shareholders' money, for their own means. And he was concerned, and here's the quote, that they would not exercise the same anxious vigilance in the care of the companies as real owners, and that what would happen is we would end up with negligence and profusion, which must almost prevail more or less in the affairs of such a company. So he was wrong to be nervous about the limited liability company. As I say, it is everything to us. But he was right to be worried about the distribution of power as a result of this type of company. But he was wrong about who would wield that power. So managerial capitalism was a problem. And then we moved forward into a system where we talked about shareholder capitalism only, and we tried to control the managers of companies by making them focus on one thing and one thing only, focusing on profits. And if we made them focus on profits, then the power remained with the shareholders because they received those profits. They became a conduit for money between the company and the shareholders. Recently, something absolutely huge has changed. Last decade, 15 years or so, we have moved from managerial capitalism to shareholder capitalism to what we can call money manager capitalism, where the majority of the power around listed limited companies rests not with individuals and not so much with managers anymore, but with huge institutional shareholders. And this is where the problem comes. So we have a new group of overlords in the Western world. And the great overlord, the biggest overlord of all, you will all know, is Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who controls the biggest fund management company that controls the largest shares of most listed companies. Every time I talk about this, I look around the room thinking, Christ, is Larry here? So far, he never has been. I've been safe. So the fund management industry is now dominated by a few giants. So in the US, you've got BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and they now manage around $20 trillion worth of assets. So around 1/3 of all the assets managed worldwide are managed by these firms. They control something like 80% of assets under management in the US. Now, even 30 years ago, the idea that one fund management company could control even 1% of a company would have seemed absurd. But today, in the US, one of those big three is the top shareholder in nearly all of the companies in the S&P 500. They control around 20% of every company in the index. And that's not just in the US, it's come to the UK as well, and it's coming to Europe. So BlackRock is now the largest asset manager in the UK. They hold something like 12% on average of every company listed in the UK, and BlackRock and Vanguard between them control over 10% of more than 2/3 of the 100 largest listed companies in the UK. Now, you may look at that and you think, well, that's not a big deal. What's 10% here or there? But given the general apathy around voting and the way you have lots of other smaller fund managers holding smaller shares, that means that they have effective power to demand that any big company does pretty much whatever they want. And if the three of them get together, they can make anybody do anything. Now, this is the most enormous change. If you think about what Smith was worried about, he was worried that under managerial capitalism, one manager could control one company. Under fund manager capitalism, money manager capitalism, what we're worried about is that one big guy at the top of one big firm can control thousands of companies. And so what you have here is one of the most extreme threats to economic liberalism and to democracy that Smith couldn't have begun to imagine this. The idea that one day there'd be someone called Larry Fink who would effectively be God, effectively be what we might like to think of a benevolent dictator, but not always a benevolent dictator. So the question then is, if we've given all this power to these people, if we have our corporate worlds controlled by a small group of fund management companies, what is it that these fund management companies want? What is it that they are doing with this power? And until recently, as I say, the answer was really not very much. They were channeling profits from the corporate world to our world. Today, something massive has changed. They have this power, and they've started to use it in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have anticipated. This stems, I think, from the financial crisis. One of the groups that completely got away with the financial crisis, walked away pretty much unscathed, was the fund management industry. We went after the banks, we went after the central banks, we went after governments, but the fund management industry sidled off to the side and kept quiet and got away with it. But who was really responsible for a lot of what happened then? To a large degree, it was the big fund management companies. We handed over stewardship responsibility to them. They were supposed to be watching the banks. They were supposed to be, their job was to look at industries and say, well, who might go bust here and who might not? And if there's something that's going to go bust, I'm going to have a word with them, or at the very least, I'm not going to invest in them. They didn't fulfill that responsibility. Then, around 2015, came along something that could absolve them from all this. Now, you've heard of woke capitalism, of course. Fraser's just been talking about it. You've heard of stakeholder capitalism. And you have probably by now heard about ESG investing, the E standing for environmental, the S standing for social, and the G standing for governance. And this is a new idea, not that new. We've had ethical investing, sustainable investing in the past, putting all three of them together and allowing the fund manager to look at it and say, we're not just about profits anymore. We're not bad people. We take our stewardship responsibilities very seriously. And from here on in, we are going to have an ESG overlay over everything that we do. And we're going to talk about it all the time. The old joke about how do you know someone's a vegan, because they're going to tell you. How do you know someone has an ESG overlay on their fund? They're going to tell you. Over and over and over again. So we now have a large group of fund managers who no longer believe that their job is to make sure the companies in which they invest are as profitable as possible in a long-term way, and to take the profits from those businesses and then return them to us so that we can retire, etc. They believe that their job is to reshape the world as they see fit, to make sure that the companies that they own parts of, i.e. all companies, worry about environmental issues, social issues, governance issues, in particular about the climate, in particular about social justice, and in particular they want them to worry about not just their shareholders, but their customers, their employees, their suppliers, and some vague sense of what community is and how they fit into however they define community. And not just in an old-fashioned way, because of course all companies have always had to care about these things, but in a carefully defined and measurable way. So over the last 5 years, this has become a major topic of conversation in the fund management industry, and hundreds of pressure groups. At last count, there are something like 180 different pressure groups putting pressure on the fund managers to put pressure on the companies. So it's a huge business, and you will have found Larry Fink and the other heads of big fund management companies on every stage globally getting global glory, telling us about this new way of investing that they also told us would make us all more money. You can do good, and you can do well at the same time, which turned out, by the way, to be absolute nonsense. So what does it mean in practice? What does it mean to have an ESG overlay? What does it mean to be a good investor, not a bad investor, and good investor in an ethical sense as opposed to an effective sense? And the answer to that is that it means everything. It means absolutely everything. ESG can now cover everything as a catch-all. You can use it to say that you're not investing in certain things. You can use it to say that you are investing in certain things and just nagging the customers all the companies all the time. Or you can just have it as some vague, fluffy thing that promises to bring about some kind of positive social or environmental change. So it's everything, and it's also crucially absolutely nothing. Because it's too fuzzy, it's too hard to quantify. Everyone uses different metrics, and we all know that, well, in finance, we like to count everything. You know, if we can count something, we feel it's real. You can't count ethics, and you can't count social justice, and you can't really count good governance either. And if you try and do that, you can only fail. You can only fail. And one of the areas where I think this is very obvious is in the area of defense. So I wrote an article back in March talking about this and saying that until March, pretty much every fund management company had some kind of defense exclusion. They would say, we absolutely will not invest in defense. It doesn't fit any of our ESG metrics. Clearly wrong. Jets use a lot of fuel, and that's a hell of a carbon footprint, for example. And anything that might hurt someone obviously is not a good thing. But of course, it's not so simple. It's not so simple at all. If you were only selling nasty things to nasty dictators, of course you wouldn't fit under E or S or G, and we would want to buy the shares anyway for G reasons, because we would be surprised if we were paid. But in a war, if you supply weapons to an invaded underdog in an unprovoked fight, or if you supply weapons to the underdog to pass along, might you not come under S? Surely you come under S. Surely suddenly weapons are a social good. Right? It's complicated. You can make similar arguments with fossil fuels. Again, every fund manager with an ESG overlay and every ESG fund wouldn't touch fossil fuels with a barge pole until a few months ago, when suddenly high energy prices destroy people's living standards, and having cheaper fossil fuels is an S. It's an S. But these are the very same fund managers who, by refusing to invest in fossil fuels, pushing them to the edge, wibbling away about stranded assets, etc., the very same people who have pushed up these energy prices in the first place. Renewable energy is another absolute classic of the genre, right? So everyone wants to invest in renewable energy. This is a good thing. So everyone wants, for example, to invest in wind turbine blades. Definitely a good thing. Not recyclable, by the way, but definitely a good thing. But you want to invest in these, but of course you don't want to invest in rare earth metals, because that's mining, and that's dirty. That's not ESG. But you can't have an energy transition without rare earth metals. So, you can't invest in turbines, but not in rare earth metals. And you also can't invest in turbines and think that you don't like coal, because what do you need to make turbines? You need steel. And what do you need to make steel? You need coal. So is coal an E now? I mean, maybe. Here we have a situation. We have handed vast amounts of power over to groups over whom we have no control. And it is our power, it is our votes. Remember, the wonderful thing about a shareholder democracy, about shareholder capitalism, is it should be the most democratic thing you can think of. One share, one vote. Everyone owns equities, and by the way, they mostly do in the Western world these days. In the UK, we have an amazing pension auto-enrollment system, which means that everybody, whether they know it or not, is an equity holder, is part of the corporate system, should have some power. We don't use it. We can't get access to it. We've handed it over to a small group of people, and they are now using it in ways that may well be bringing about a new crisis. Their do-goodery leads them down roads that maybe we wouldn't have wanted to go down had we understood the implications. So that's the bad news. The good news, and let me end with that, is that, as I say, I've been writing about this for a while. In fact, I was accused by the New Statesman, I'm quite proud of this, of having kicked off the anti-ESG movement. No? Good, right? Sometimes you win. Since then, and since the war in Ukraine began, there's been huge traction here. There is a new movement to try and, from the fund management companies themselves, as well as from investors, to say, hang on a tick here, this is silly. We can't try and file everything under an ESG banner. We can't try and count everything, and we can't make these black and white judgments. Everything is much more nuanced. So we are beginning to see money flowing from ESG sectors, from do-goodery sectors, tech, etc., into the sectors that we actually need. Vanguard and BlackRock BlackRock are beginning to talk again about the importance of fossil fuels and how they should make sure that they don't refuse to invest in this stuff completely. And, nearly done, 30 seconds, at the same time, we're beginning to see some pressure from investing groups and also from the fund managers and also from politicians, finally and crucially, to find a way to return the power that we've given to the fund managers to ordinary people, to find a way for us to use the votes that we should have via the fund managers. So, key point. It got very bad. It's beginning to reverse. And when it does, shareholder democracy will be renewed, and with it, I think, will come a renewal of capitalism.
Thank you. Merryn, are there no antitrust laws that can break up these big companies that now dominate the market?
Well, much discussion about that, in the same way there is about technology companies, but it hasn't reached the same level. I think it is something quite new to people to understand the extent to which these big fund management companies control the environment. And it is also only recently that people have, noticed how much money they run, because it's come with the rise of passive investing to a large degree, how much money they run, but also how much control that gives them. Because it wasn't until, for example, Larry in particular started writing his annual letter about what he expected from companies around the world, that people started to look at that and go, wow, not only do you expect that, but you could enforce it. And nobody asked us first. So I think it's just beginning, this understanding that a fund management company can be too big and it can be too powerful. And interestingly, the fund management companies know that as well. So when I say there is talk from the fund management companies about trying to return power to the beneficial owners of shares, to us, I think that is because they recognize they've got themselves in a fairly untenable position.
And you're quite optimistic about a new system of accountability arising.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always optimistic. Actually, that's not fair. I'm terribly pessimistic. But I'm quite optimistic about this, very optimistic about this, because there is, as I say, there's a lot of pressure coming now, not just from grassroots investing groups, which is where it has been for the last few years, but also from politicians, particularly in the US. There's a lot of movement around trying to make sure that the big fund management companies both ask end investors what it is they want and follow through. So already BlackRock has started to return some of its proxy votes to other fund management companies, which is not quite what we want. We don't want big fund manager to give power back to big fund manager. We want them to give power back to ordinary people. But it proves that the technology exists and a little bit of the momentum has begun to build. So no, I'm very optimistic. And I do think that if we can get our votes back and we can reconnect our populations to the way that they already have a stake in corporate capitalism, it will be an excellent thing.
Thank you.